Hi, and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature, where we're looking at Urvashi Butalia's work, The Other Side of Silence. So we'll just continue from where we left last time, and now we move on to a more statistical account of partition in terms of how many people suffered and how many people died, in terms of the numbers, in terms of the people who were transported, migrated forcibly, right? So, and just before that, if you remember, there's a very emotional account of Dayawanti, Butalia's grandmother, and there's a lot of speculation in terms of what it must have been for her at the twilight of her life to live the rest of her existing days in Pakistan, away from her family. And the twilight image, the silent twilight image, is a very important metaphor, as we discussed last time. It sort of marks the transition from one era to another era, from one compound of space and time to another one, and the transition that occurred, it was obviously a painful transition, a painful shift, and that's something which we see described in very evocative details. So from that evocative emotional account of partition, we move on to a more statistical account, and this should be on your screen, where Butalia goes on to say 12 million people were displaced as a result of partition. Nearly 1 million died. Some 75,000 women were raped, kidnapped, abducted, forcibly impregnated by men of the other religion. Thousands of families were split apart, homes burnt down and destroyed, villages abandoned, refugee camps became part of the landscape of most major cities in the north. But a half-century later, there is still no memorial, no memory, no recall, except what is guarded and now rapidly dying in family history and collective memory. So this becomes a very interesting point, and obviously this is written at a time before the Partition Museum happened. So now we have a museum in Amritsar. By the time in which this book was written, there was no Partition Museum. In fact, there are some very interesting works. I mean, I recommend Aninda Rai Chaudhury's a very interesting paper about the absence of a Partition Museum. Aninda Rai Chaudhury is a lecturer, senior lecturer in the University of St. Andrews. So those of you interested in that, you can look him up. You can find the paper somewhere, request access to him. Right? It deals with the absence of a museum. Right? Why is there no Partition Museum? Of course, in more recent times, we do have a museum now. But then, even so, what Butalia was writing in the book, this is almost 50 years after, and there was no museum, there was no memorial, there's no monument of partition, and one of the reasons why that may have happened for a long time is because the whole idea, the whole experience of partition, the whole account, the whole violence of partition took place because of the formation of two different nation states, India and Pakistan, as a result of which there was this communal divide, there was this communal violence, there was riot, and all this terrible statistics that Butalia is offering over here in terms of number of people killed, impregnated, violated. So it's just one of the biggest human tragedies in the history of humanity, for the matter. I mean, you can just read it one more time. 12 million people were displaced, right? Out of which 1 million people died. 75,000 women were raped, kidnapped, abducted, and impregnated by men of the other religion. So again, if you take a look at the violence over here, it's directed towards the woman's body, right? And that goes to show how, there's a very morbid mixture of sexuality and violence over here, which is something which you find in Sadat Hassan Manto's stories as well, one of which we have read already. But the reason why Butalia is giving such a gory, graphic account of the number of people who were affected, killed, tortured, violated sexually, and then, of course, how entire villages were burnt, homes were burnt down, places were abandoned, refugee camps became the major landscapes of most cities, and yet, despite all that, 50 years later, there is still no memorial for that, right? So the lack of the memorial, the lack of an institutional body of memory about partition becomes a very conspicuous absence. And as I mentioned, one of the reasons why that may have happened was the fact that any construction of a museum, any construction of an archive or a monument obviously corresponds to the glory of the state, the glory of the particular nation. And of course, the very fact that the nations emerged out of the partition was a matter of tragedy, was a matter of shame, was a matter of something that you don't want to remember. right? Because the very formation of these two nations happened simultaneously with the violence and tragedy of the deep human tragedy of partition. So the sort of not acknowledging that was part of the collective guilt, was part of the state guilt, was part of the the guilt that happened around that time. So it was simultaneous in quality, right? The formation of the two nation states and the whole experience of partition. So there are very complex factors why there was a lack of a museum for the longest time. So the fact that the state emerged out of the violence, so to remember the violence would be to sort of acknowledge it. So that obviously became a discomfort for both states, for both nation states for the longest time. And only recently, as I mentioned, do we have a partition museum in Amritsar. Okay, but this is a question that she asks here. Why is there no memorial, no state monument, no archive, no museum for partition? And the only memory which is available are memories which are family history, memories which people tell each other through informal stories. That's the only recourse one has if one is to do serious research in partition. You need to dig up those stories that people tell each other intergenerationally, right? So that becomes the only available resource. So some of the tales I heard when I began my research seemed so fantastic that they were difficult to believe. We had heard time and again that in many villages on both sides of the border, hundreds of women had jumped or were forced to jump into wells because they feared that they would be taken away, raped, abducted, forced to convert to the other religion. So as we can see, there's a constant pointer to the fact that during moments of violence, during moments of communal violence, collective violence, the first site where the violence takes place is a female body, right? That becomes it's just such a tragic, morbid, gory thing, but at the same time, it is also the site which symbolizes the violence, because the violence on a female body is physical as well as sexual and mental and psychological. So there's a quality of invasion, right, that takes place where the female body is sort of invaded by the other men, impregnated by the other men. So that's sexual violence as well. And of course, in order to protect the woman from that kind of violence, they were forced to commit suicide, forced to jump in the wells. So either way, the females, the woman became the biggest casualty, the most helpless fodder for violence, when this incident took place. Right? And of course, what Butalia is suggesting over here, when the stories are told and retold, they become slightly hyperbolic in quality. Hyperbole as in adding elements to it, adding numbers to it, adding intensity to it. So the hyperbolic quality of the stories about partition is very much part of the collective memory. So there are accounts of how hundreds of women jumped in the well, or were made to jump in the well, forced to jump in the well in order to be protected from sexual violence, or to be protected from converting to the other religion, right? So even you can take a look, you can read the process of conversion to another religion as also an act of violence. We saw how the narrator's grandmother, Dayawanti, who had become Aisha Bibi and was buried in the end because she had to become Muslim. So that change in identity is also a form of violence, so some kind of an existential violence, right? So in order to protect the woman from that, they were pushed into suicide, pushed to kill themselves. And that obviously makes the tragedy morbid, as well as, it just shows a spectacular helplessness of the subjects, especially the female subjects, against this whimsical, irrational violence of partition. This seemed bizarre. Could the pull of religion be so strong that people, more specifically women, would actually kill themselves? Then I met Bir Bahadur Singh's mother, Basant Kaur. Basant Kaur, a tall, strapping woman in her mid-60s, had been present in a village, Thoa Khalsa, in March 1947, when the decision was taken the woman should jump into a well. She watched with more than 90 women throw themselves into a well for fear of the Muslims. She too jumped in, but survived because there was not water in the well, enough water in the well to drown them all. She said it's like when you put rotis into a tandoor, and if it is too full, the one near the top, they don't cook, they have to be taken out. So the well filled up and we could not drown. Those who died, died, and those who were alive, they pulled out. So, this is a deeply disturbing account, as you can see. And the way it is described using very domestic metaphors, very familial metaphors, culinary kitchen metaphors, makes it even more problematic. Because, if you just remember, if you go back, we read the Catch-22, where we saw that the intensity of trauma, the intensity of violence, or mental violence, or psychological violence, was communicated to us using very banal metaphors, almost funny metaphors. Over here, too, we have the account of a woman who survived this mass or collective suicide simply because there were so many women already dead in the well that when she jumped, along with some of the women, they could not jump in the water because the well had almost been filled up with dead people, with corpses. So, no one could die anymore, because if you jump, you'd be caught by the corpses. So it's a very, very morbid image. But what makes it more unsettling is the metaphors chosen to describe that image. Metaphors which are culinary in quality, kitchen in quality, familiar in quality, right? And this almost intimate metaphors of making a roti on a tandoor, right? So the analogy she gives is, if you put too many rotis on a tandoor, the one on top doesn't get cooked, so you have to take it out. So similarly, I was the roti on top of a tandoor. I had to be taken out. That's how I survived, right? So it just becomes a very morbid metaphor, and at the same time, it's telling and compelling in a way, how the experience of partition, the experience of violence around the partition must have felt like. And Bir Bahadur Singh, her son, had watched his father kill his sister, again, so to protect some kind of an honor killing, to protect the woman from being converted to the other religion. So their own kins, their own male relatives killed them, and that was dressed up as some kind of an honor code, right? So, not to be converted, we killed the woman, and that seems to be some kind of a preservation strategy, some preservation of identity. He described the incident with pride in his voice, pride at his sister's courage and her martyrdom, right? So this is described as a heroic emotion, a heroic account, a heroic experience, where women are protecting their identity, protecting their religion, protecting the cultural location by willingly getting killed by their own brothers and fathers and husbands, because the other religion people would come and take them away and convert them into the other religion, or sexually violate them. So they would much rather choose to die in the hands of their male kins. So we can see how there's a very complex psychological quality in this whole thing, and which is sickening, which is tragic, which is morbid, which is something that we probably find absurd and shocking at the same time. But these are people who acted that way at that point of time, and that, for some reason, that seemed to be the rational response at that point of time. That seemed to have been the right response at that point of time. To protect your identity, you give away your biological body, you give away yourself, you get killed happily by, and the honor lies over here in being killed by your own male relative, right? So you die as, preserving your identity as a Hindu woman or a Muslim woman, or whatever religion is, right? But the point being that it becomes the onus of the woman to protect the cultural identity, to protect the religious identity, right? So, and of course, the men who are telling the stories describe the woman who chose to get killed as martyrs, as heroes. So he told the incident, described the incident with pride in his voice, pride at his sister's courage and her martyrdom, for she could now be placed alongside other martyrs of the Sikh religion, right? So the Sikh religion, she's now one of those martyrs, one of those heroic martyrs who are now deified. The first time I had been alerted to family deaths, that is, men or families killing of their women and children, was when I had met an old man, Mangal Singh, in Amritsar during the course of making the film A Division of Hearts. So this is a film that she was making. She was helming the project, and then she met this person called Mangal Singh, who gave her a very disturbing and graphic and gory account of killing women and children to protect them from being converted to the other religion. Mangal Singh told me that he and his two brothers had taken the decision to kill. They use the word martyr. Again, the word martyr becomes interesting because that seems to have a lot of affective investment to it, right? So you become a martyr because you die for a cause. You die to preserve a certain kind of cause, to preserve a certain kind of identity, right? 17 members of the family, right? So that decision was taken. 17 members of the family were to be killed. We had to do this, he told me, because otherwise they would have been converted. Having done this duty, Mangal Singh crossed over into Amritsar, where he began a new life. When I met him, he was the only one left of the tree. He had a new family, a wife, children, grandchildren, all of whom had heard and dismissed his stories. Why do you want to know all this? He kept asking me. What is the use? I told him I wanted to know how he had coped with the grief, the sense of loss, the guilt. He said, hunger drives all sorrow and grief away. You understand, when you don't have anything, then what's the point of having sorrow and grief? So we see how the whole experience of partition, the whole trauma of partition, it depicts to us the nadir of humanity to a certain extent, that you reach the lowest point in humanity, where you can't even feel grief, you can't even mourn because you're so hungry. And that animalistic quality of the tragedy is something which we find depicted over and over again. And it's an animalization of the tragedy, it's a corporealization of the tragedy. You just become the hungry body. You don't have the mind, you don't have the mind or the mental health to grieve over your loss, because your body is too hungry and it needs to be fed, right? And that, as I mentioned, that depicts the nadir of humanity, the sort of lowest ebb, the lowest point in humanity, where even to mourn for a tragedy is a luxury that not many people have. So when this person was asked that, having killed 17 members of the family, when he crossed over and when he started a new life, so at the moment where the tragedy happened, did he not feel any grieved? How did he cope with that grief? As he answers now, I was too hungry, right? So when you don't have anything, then you don't have the luxury to experience pain, sorrow, grief, bereavement, etc., right? So again, we're talking about grief as some kind of even grief becomes a grieving, a mourning becomes some kind of a luxury activity. It's a marker of privilege. Not everyone can mourn at any given point of time. And again, if you remember one of the stories which we read during this course, which was The Fly by Catherine Mansfield, where there's a lot of agency and privilege, masculinity, which is associated with mourning. So to be able to mourn in a pure way is a marker of masculinity. It's a marker of privilege. Not everyone can do that. And here we have just the opposite. There are people who just don't have any food in the stomach. They're hungry. They're like hungry animals. So where is the time and mental condition or the physical condition to mourn? It's just the body's dying of hunger, and that becomes more important rather than the psychology or the mental condition for mourning. Okay, and that recursive question, why do you want to know this? Why do you want to know the story again? Is something that she's subjected to over and over again, Urvashi Butalia, right? So, and that in a way corresponds to the refusal to remember, the rejection of remembrance to a certain extent. That there's certain people who don't want to remember, who don't want to retell the story, who don't want to recount what happened to them many years ago. And that is a question that she experiences, and she gets asked quite often during this project. So why do you want to know this? This is a question that I have been asked again and again by the people I have wanted to interview, or those to whom I have tried to present my work. 2 or 3 times, having begun work in Partition, I gathered my courage and read a couple of papers in academic gatherings. I wanted to share some questions that have been bothering me. Why, for example, had straight historical accounts not been able to really address the underside of the history of Partition, to gather together the experiences of people, to see what role they had played in shaping the India we know today? Was it that they knew that they would have to deal with a story so riven with pain and grief, a story that was so close to so many people, for in many ways several of the families were partition refugees, that some time had to elapse between the work actually began, right? So we're talking about 2 kinds of memory over here, which is interesting. And there's traumatic memory and narrative memory. So traumatic memory is a memory which is very close to the moment of trauma, when the brain and the mind still processes the trauma and is unable to process it completely. So only when the entire process is complete, which takes some period of time, sometimes many years, sometimes a long period of time, only after that will traumatic memory can be normally converted into a narrative memory, in the sense that it can become a story, that it can become some kind of an account, some representative account of the trauma, right? But for that to happen, there has to be a passage of time, which is indefinite in quality. You can't define, you can't quantify or predict that quantity of time, right? So traumatic memory becoming narrative memory always goes through a process of transition. And one of the reasons why Butalia struggles to get these accounts from people is because she sort of theorizes that maybe it's still too traumatic in their minds. It hasn't had the time to become narrative memory to a large extent. Okay, so I wanted to understand how to read the many stories I was now hearing. I knew that without being a historian, that I could not look at this unproblematically, right? So could I, for example, rely on the truth of the stories I was hearing? How much could one just trust memory after all these years? For many of those who chose to tell me the stories, I must have been just another listener. The experience perhaps just another telling. I knew that my being middle class, a woman, a Punjabi, perhaps half a Sikh, would have dictated the way people actually responded. What value then ought I to place on their memory, their recall? Often what emerged from the interview was so bitter, so full of rage, resentment, communal feeling, that it frightened me. What was I to do with such material? Was it incumbent on me, as I might have been historian, to try to be true to this material? Or should I, as a secular Indian, actually exercise some care about what I made visible and what I did not? So we can have a series of self-questioning that she is subjecting herself to. So how much of this is trustworthy? How much of this is reliable? How much of this should I draw on? Should I exercise caution? Should I use a more guarded interpretative frame before I can choose to filter out the stories from what really happened and what did not happen? And how do I make the difference? And not just that, she also knows that her position as a middle-class Punjabi woman, half Sikh, it also shapes the stories to a large extent, right? So her ethnicity, her gender location, her class location, all these become important factors in terms of shaping the stories of the people. So again, reliability becomes a very important factor. Trustworthiness becomes a very important factor. The ontology of truth becomes a very important factor. And she knows there is no truth per se. There are just narrative truths, right? So that's the only thing that she can rely on, right? So narrative truth being the truth that lies in a story. I mean, that is a function of storytelling, not so much a function of what really happened, but it's a function of storytelling in the sense that it has a lot of emotional quotient to it, has a lot of emotional investment to it, which creates this order of narrative truth as a story. It's an incident which may or may not have happened in the first place as a matter of fact, but as a matter of story with emotional investment, with personal investment, that just gets embellished into a narrative truth. So how do we make the difference between the two orders of truth is something that she cannot quite quantify. Okay. A question that has dogged me constantly has been, is it fair to make these interviews public if they relate, as mine do, to only one side of the story? Doesn't that sort of material lend itself to misuse by one side or another? To this day, I have not solved this dilemma. Right, so she says that you can only hear one side of the story. You cannot hear the other side. So, for example, if you go to a family on Partition and you ask them about their experience, and they might tell you that they were tortured, they were asked to go away, and they were abandoned by everyone because of the religious location, etc. Right? It could work in either way from both sides. But the problem that immediately crops up is the fact that we don't quite get to understand what must have happened on the perpetrator's mind. Why is it that people suddenly come in a village and ask everyone else to leave because of religious location, despite having lived together for generations, for centuries, right? So we don't quite get to know the rationale for this kind of behavior. We don't quite get to know the other side. And that's the reason why this whole title becomes so evocative, the other side of silence. The silence becomes the stories of partition. So how do you get to the other side? How do you cross over? Right? And how do you determine what's true, what's not true? How do you determine the rationality behind these acts? So these are the burning questions. And of course, the moral dilemma about whether these stories should be made public, whether these stories should be shared in a collective public medium accessible to everyone, right? Or should I respect the privacy of the storyteller, the anonymity of the storyteller? Should I maintain that? So I have not solved this dilemma. I am torn between the desire to be honest and to be careful. And all the time I was asked, why are you doing this? The question became important for another reason. The way borders were drawn between our two countries, it was virtually impossible for me to travel to Pakistan to do research or even to carry out interviews. The result was that my work remained and still does, very one-sided. I knew that this was not right. I didn't know. I still don't know what I should be doing. Ought I to have given up at the work? There are no easy answers. But in the end, I decided that if the search meant so much to me, I simply had to go on with it. I could not abandon it. So this becomes part of the abundant project scenario. And she sort of understands that there's a degree of futility in her research, because she will only access one side of the story and she'll never be able to go to the other side. So the best she can do is go to Pakistan and perhaps find out her Sikh relatives who have now become Muslims because they had to convert. But that will hardly give the holistic picture, right? And this acknowledgement of incompletion, this awareness of incompletion, obviously is frustrating at different levels, at a historical level, at a research level, etc. So there are these pulls she faces or experiences inside her to give up the project, right? And she comes quite close, but then there are no easy answers, but she goes on in a very dogged way, despite the ethical, moral dilemma, despite the lack of the whole story, despite the absence of completion. So all these are the factors which are the impediments in her research. But then she continues to go on, right? And this seems to be her project. This seems to be her, this determination. This seems to be a dogged determination in terms of finding out about the partition. So I stop at this point today. But what I would just like to reiterate is that the very ontology of partition, it works at so many levels. It's a cartographic partition. It's an identity partition. People get divided. The identities get fractured and divided. But this also happens at a level of the narrative, right? So even the narratives are partition. We never get to know what is the other side of the story, because every story has multiple sides. We just get to see one narrative. We just get to see one perspective of the narrative. So what about the other perspectives, which might give you a fuller, more complex picture, which remains elusive, which remains incomplete, which remains incomprehensible in so many degrees, right? So that acknowledgement of incompletion is important over here, and that admission of absence, admission that it's not complete, it's never going to be complete, that admission becomes, in a very curious way, the foundational force of this entire research, right? Knowing very well the research will never be complete, right? And that becomes, in a way, rather than, a discouraging motive, that becomes the driving force of this motive, because it's a very different kind of research where all you can get is stories, all you can get is immersion. And there's no way that you can check the validity or verify the validity of the stories. There is a narrative truth which sometimes becomes more important than the factual historical truth, right? And that becomes the sentiment, that becomes the affective architecture that a historian will have to navigate with, despite all the training, despite all the scholarship, despite all the research acumen the person may have. The affective apparatus is something which is unmappable, and this unmappability of the affective apparatus makes it a very difficult category, a very complex category to locate. At the same time, it invests a very strong affective element in this research. So it's not just about data and dates and figures, it's about the emotions that those dates and figures and data contain, right? So as you can see, if you go back at the beginning of this session, this particular session, when you hear these millions of people who are killed and brutally sexually attacked, violated, impregnated, so all the numbers that come, they don't remain numbers, they become affective categories, they become emotional categories. That all that does something to our mind when we read that. The gory graphic details, it almost becomes illustrations, visual images of torture, visual images of exploitation, visual images of sexual violation. So numbers shift to affect, numbers shift or transition, make a transition or metamorphose into memories of violence, right? And that metamorphosis, that transition becomes important, and that transition comes at a cost. That metamorphosis of numbers and data into effect comes at a cost of completion, right? So this is the kind of research which will never be complete. This is the kind of research which will never have a closure per se, because we'll never get to hear the full story. But what we'll get is this incomplete effect, this incomplete emotions, and we must honor the incompletion of it. We must acknowledge the incompletion of it, and that will, in a strange way, will become the foundational force of a research of this quality, a research of this category, right? So we'll stop at this point today, and we'll begin to wind up this book in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.